Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is all about developments in African civilizations between 1200 and 1450, another of our main topics in our first unit. In this first unit, the global tapestry, we are taking snapshots of the political, social, cultural, and economic developments of different late post-classical period civilizations. Last time we spun the globe and landed in the Western Hemisphere, where we studied early American civilizations between 1200 and 1450. And today we will spin the globe once more and find our focus back on the Eastern Hemisphere and study early African civilizations. Like we did with our study of our previous civilizations, we will look for trends, parallels, and points of comparison and contrast among these early African civilizations and the other civilizations we have and will study within the global tapestry. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of this learning objective. Number one, explain how and why states in Africa developed and changed over time. The political history of Africa is limited in that so much of Africa's events prior to 1000 CE went undocumented. Oral traditions were common in early African societies, and it took centuries before those stories and histories were recorded. Unfortunately, a complete historical record of all of Africa's political development is an impossibility. However, enough historical documentation is available that many political, social, and demographic patterns were firmly established prior to 1000 CE. The primary pattern in Africa's prehistory and history was the migration and settlement patterns of the Bantu peoples throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The Bantu peoples populated sub-Saharan Africa over what is believed to have been a near 3,000-year process of migration and settlement. The Bantu diaspora links the various African communities through a common linguistic pattern found from as far north as Cameroon and Nigeria to as far south as South Africa. Additionally, Bantu peoples introduced agricultural techniques and iron metallurgy into the regions that they settled. Thus, the Bantu were most responsible for the initial agricultural and permanent settlements that were established in sub-Saharan Africa. As agricultural production increased, demographic sustainability also increased. In many sub-Saharan African locations, populations remained manageable without the existence of a government or state. Rather, smaller and more manageable African populations utilized kinship groups to keep social order. Kinship groups included smaller organizations called lineages, which were characterized by dozens of immediate and extended relatives with identified and recognized common ancestry. Kinship groups also included larger organizations called clans, which were characterized by hundreds and sometimes thousands of people from multiple lineages who deemed each other to be from the same ancestry, but were not in the immediate familiarity of the same lineage. They also practiced communal agriculture and a system of labor that utilized dependence within kinship groups as a precursor to African slavery. In essence, in many stateless African societies, it was the number of productive dependents one had rather than the amount of land one owned that determined one's status within a kinship group. African clans lived in villages, and in some cases, African villages grew in size and began to depend on each other for scarce resources. Oftentimes, a village that was more prominent was able to gain control of the other nearby villages that shared commercial and territorial interests. Although there was a lack of bureaucratic efficiency and preserved written records, the more dominant villages exercised their political authority through chiefdoms. In essence, a single African chief would oversee multiple villages within his political and militant threshold. The communal agricultural and labor practices were often retained in the villages that were regulated by a chieftain, but the benefit of those practices were bestowed onto the chief and his closest elites. Finally, some societies in Africa achieved the levels of state and empire development. In most cases, African states and empires emerged in parts of Africa that were most integrated with lucrative systems of economic exchange and other prosperous civilizations. For example, in West Africa, states and empires emerged and succeeded by benefiting from the wealth accumulated through the exchange of goods along the Trans-Sahara trade route, or the sand roads. Additionally, the states of East Africa emerged and benefited from their proximity to and participation in the exchanges made in the Indian Ocean complex. Additionally, the commercial and diplomatic relationships that large East and West African states and empires made with Islamic civilizations in North Africa and South and Southwest Asia afforded greater political credibility and legitimacy to their subjects and neighboring peoples. In West Africa, the Sudanic states and empires emerged to the west of the Kanem-Bornu Empire and the Hausa kingdoms. It is in this region of sub-Saharan Africa where the most prominent and prosperous states were built before 1500 CE. One of the earliest Sudanic states of West Africa was the Kingdom of Ghana. Between the 8th and the 13th centuries, the Kingdom of Ghana was the wealthiest and most powerful of the West African states. Arab Muslim merchants from North Africa made their way across the Sahara Desert and began to make commercial exchanges with the people of the Kingdom of Ghana. And as early as the 10th century, the kings of Ghana had converted to Islam. Reigning over parts of the contemporary African nations of Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal, the Kingdom of Ghana was a major supplier of gold to Arab Muslim merchants. In fact, gold was exchanged pound for pound with salt that was introduced to Ghana from Arab Muslim merchants who peddled salt from the salt mines of North Africa. Additionally, the Kingdom of Ghana gained enormous wealth from its contribution of West African slaves to Arab Muslim merchants, who would then transport the slaves to North African slave markets. The Kingdom of Ghana's most impressive city was its capital at Kumba Saleh, which in the 10th century was heralded by Muslim travelers as a wealthy city with a gold-studded palace that was the residence of the wealthiest people on earth. Later in the 13th century, as the Kingdom of Ghana declined, many of its people and territories were absorbed into a nearby emerging Sudanic empire. That Sudanic empire was the Malian Empire. During the 13th century, the largest and most prosperous empire in West Africa was the Malian Empire. Established by Sundiata, the Lion Prince, the Malian Empire grew to absorb the peoples and territories of the contemporary African nations of Mali, Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. Historically, it is unclear exactly when the Malian kings converted to Islam, as there exists conflicting historical sources as to Sundiata's personal religion. However, it is historically documented that Sundiata's grandson, Mansa Musa, was a devout Muslim who sponsored Islam and was responsible for its popularity in most of West Africa. Mansa Musa invited Muslim scholars, such as Ibn Battuta, to encourage the development of proper religious practices, Quranic studies, and Sharia legal practices. He also sponsored the building of mosques and Islamic schools. Mansa Musa also led one of the most well-known pilgrimages in the history of the world when he led more than 60,000 people on the Hajj to Mecca. On his way to Mecca, Mansa Musa visited Cairo in Egypt, and bestowed on the marketplaces and peoples of Cairo an immense amount of Malian gold. In fact, his gifting of the gold was so great that it actually devalued Cairo's currency and inflated the prices of crops and goods in the marketplace. Mansa Musa was extremely wealthy due to Mali's control of the gold trade in the 14th century. Like its predecessor, the Kingdom of Ghana, Mali benefited from the Trans-Sahara trade route with the Arab Muslims to the north. Mali's elaborate bureaucracy, tributary system, and prosperous cities such as Gao, Djenné, and Timbuktu guaranteed the continuous accumulation of wealth until its demise in the late 15th century. In East Africa, the states and empires were not as large physically as the ones in West Africa. However, that did not mean they were not militarily and politically strong and economically prosperous. Between the 11th and beginning of the 16th centuries, city-states prospered along the East African coastline. These city-states have been referred to as the Swahili city-states, since the most common language of the city-states was Swahili. Swahili is a Bantu language that adopted aspects of the Arabic language, making it a syncretic or blended language. The East African coastline and the Swahili city-states were integrated with South, Southwest, Southeast, and even East Asian societies through the Indian Ocean complex. The Swahili city-states peddled gold, slaves, ivory, and local exotic products from the interior of African society, such as the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, to Indian, Arab, Persian, and Chinese merchants in exchange for pottery such as Chinese porcelain, glass, and textiles such as Indian cotton and Chinese silk. These Swahili city-states were also characterized by their adoption and sponsorship of Islam. Islam had been introduced to East Africa during the 8th century, but over time it gained immense popularity with the political and economic elites of the Swahili city-states. Examples of some of the most prominent and successful Swahili city-states were Mogadishu in current-day Somalia, Zanzibar in current-day Tanzania, Mombasa in current-day Kenya, and Kilwa in current-day Tanzania. Each of these city-states would have their political sovereignty and economic prosperity challenged and disrupted with the arrival of the Portuguese in the early 16th century. Not all states in East Africa were Islamic. In fact, the Kingdom of Aksum, a state in East Africa that existed in contemporary Ethiopia, reigned from the 2nd century CE through the 9th century CE, and it housed a continuous Christian population throughout the post-classical period and even beyond. In fact, today, Ethiopia is one of the largest populations of Christians in all of Africa. During the 4th century, the Aksumite king, Ezana, entered a diplomatic relationship with the Roman Emperor Constantine II, and many of the inhabitants of Aksum would adopt Christianity. Eventually, an Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity would emerge, and the empire would retain its Christian identity during a time of great Islamic influence in East Africa. Aksum, like the Swahili city-states would do, gained wealth accumulation as a major participant in East African trade along the Indian Ocean complex, as it held ports in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. In parts of sub-Sahara Africa, the reaches of Christianity and Islam failed to grasp tightly onto some states and empires prior to 1400. For example, Great Zimbabwe, an impressive city within the large Kingdom of Zimbabwe in the southeastern interior of Africa, reigned from the 11th century into the 15th century. The city was adorned with impressive stone architecture, including palaces, fortifications, and residential buildings. At its height, it hosted a population of approximately 18,000 inhabitants. It was able to accumulate wealth through its regulation of commercial exchanges of slaves, ivory, and gold to the Swahili city-states on the East African coastline. Though the Kingdom of Zimbabwe was in close proximity to the Islamic states of the East African coast, it retained its African religious traditions and its single supreme creator deity. Another example of a powerful African state that kept its African religious traditions throughout the post-classical period was the Kingdom of the Congo. From the 14th to the 17th century, the Kingdom of the Congo was the largest and most politically centralized kingdom on the southwest coast of Africa. It reigned over several smaller African states in the contemporary nations of Angola and the Republic of the Congo. It was agriculturally productive in its practices of communal agriculture and slavery. The Kingdom of the Congo controlled commercial exchanges that were made through the Congo River. Its currency system was based on cowrie shells received from the Indian Ocean, which suggests that the Kingdom of the Congo was not completely isolated from the other side of Africa prior to the arrival of the Portuguese and the other Europeans in the late 15th century. It retained its traditional Bantu religious beliefs until the late 15th century, when the Portuguese arrived and successfully converted the King of the Congo and many other social and political elites to Roman Catholicism. Let's consider some parallels between early African civilizations and the other civilizations we've studied to this point in Unit 1, the Global Tapestry. Consider state building in Africa and how it compared with state building in early American and Asian civilizations. Did smaller scale states, like small kingdoms and city-states of Africa, develop similarly to the smaller kingdoms and city-states of the Americas or of South and Southeast Asia? Was the Malian Empire comparable in their developments of state with the imperial dynasties of China, or even the Islamic world, or even the Aztec and Inca empires? Did trade routes and foreign influences alter economics and culture in African civilizations as they did in American and Asian civilizations? Again, do not just look to study these global tapestry civilizations as isolated societies. Think like an historian and make the connections and parallels among these global tapestry civilizations.